very much a kind of a personal mindset shift about like shifting what you think is possible, and actually really demonstrating that and going through that process and realizing kind of how much actually a mindset shift. And I think Carl, you spoke about this the other evening. But just kind of actually how much of it is in our minds, and how much when you extend kind of your comfort zone and get out of it, you can really kind of shift the potential of what you think is possible. And that's actually what we're really trying to do with Big Change, is not only kind of think differently about what is possible for young people and for the next generation, but also think about what's possible in terms of driving change. The education sector and kind of some of the big kind of big indicators, I suppose, about social mobility, about equality, about big mental health gaps, well, rising mental health issues and learning gaps between the advantaged and the disadvantaged, are seen as these stagnant, intractable problems that just can't be solved. And actually we believe that they can be solved, that you just need to look at them differently and really kind of think about what is possible. And so the way that Big Change thinks about charity is actually kind of finding and backing brilliant, extraordinary people who have shifted their mindset and are thinking, actually, how can we drive change? How can we focus on the areas where we really can make a difference? I'll give you a couple of examples of past Strive and how we've managed to make a difference. But I first wanted to introduce Jen Lexmond, who's like rocking her kind of student youth hostel vibes. Yeah. Who is one of our amazing project partners. Yes. Jen actually first came, Big Change first came across Jen 4 years ago when she came to talk to us about the importance of early intervention and early years, and about kind of changing young people's life chances at that early stage, and how much more leverage you can have. And leverage sounds like a kind of very clinical way of looking at it, but actually it's much easier to build a strong child than it is to fix a broken adult. And so Jen was talking to us then about a lot of the kind of evidence and research in the space. She's since set up an organisation which is doing great things. And actually, should we start there? We can talk a bit about kind of no, I'm going to give you one more bit of context in terms of the Big Change model first, just to help like understand how and why kind of we do what we do. So Big Change was founded 5 years ago now to think differently about how charity can be a catalyst for positive change. So really, rather than treating symptoms of a broken system, looking at what are the root causes and how can we prevent issues. And so what we do is we spend a lot of time finding out where are there kind of key areas where where there's a root cause or something that if we change that, it would have a disproportionate impact on the lives of young people, particularly those that are disadvantaged. One of the areas that's previously been kind of unearthed and supported by Strive from 2014 to 2016 was the area of communication. So it seems like, you know, that's not a kind of particularly urgent area to focus on for young people, but actually your ability to communicate, to deal with conflict, to build relationships, to ask questions in class, to put yourself forward, to have your voice heard, is actually a fundamental element of your ability to kind of progress. And at the moment, there are not only kind of major challenges, which Jen will talk to kind of in the early years, but on average, young people are speaking 4 words per lesson. So Strive in 2014 backed an amazing project called Voice 21, which was looking at how do we kind of change the ethos within schools to actually not only develop communication lessons, so we're actually helping young people think about how they can communicate, but also changing the culture within schools. So rather than doing essays, young people are going and actually doing presentations, and they're sharing, they're kind of presenting and kind of doing an exhibit with their about the First World War, for example, to their families and their communities, so that they're actually teaching them and learning in order to teach others. And the amazing work they were doing in Voice 21 was in one school, and it was seeing extraordinary outcomes. But with the money and support from Strive, it's now reached 200 schools across the UK, and they're now influencing. I think they won an innovation award from the Global 100 Best Innovations in 2017. They've also kind of trained up and supported over 2,000 teachers across the UK. Now things are being set up in the US, it's being exported to different countries, and they've also recently, oracy has gone up the agenda in the kind of policy world, so it's now being recognised alongside reading and writing as a critical skill and a part of human development, and becoming even more essential in the kind of world today, which is much more kind of connected but not connected. And so Strive, that's early support of £150,000 to that one project in 2014 has now gone on to have huge impact. Cross-party support, there's an all-party parliamentary group about oracy, and there was no other funding for that project. We were the first people to support it. And so that's what we do. We find these areas where no one else is supporting, but if you actually helped make a difference there, you can change young people's lives. I mean, that's 2,000 teachers across the UK who each have classes of about 30 who are helping really unlock the potential of those young people to find their voice, feel valued, and actually really kind of be asking questions and moving on in their lives. So that's just one example of one of the 18 projects that we've supported so far that are going on to make real waves. And this year with Strive, we're supporting kind of 3 key areas where we've identified real kind of leverage points where if we change this again, it's going to really have an impact. One of them is early years, which Jen's going to talk more about in a minute, and the importance of focusing there. The second area is teachers thriving. We have a real kind of actually, it's kind of, I don't know how to describe it. I was going to say epidemic, but it's not quite an epidemic. It's just a bit of a tragedy actually in terms of the number of teachers that are burning out and leaving the profession in the UK, but also in countries around the world because of the pressures that they're facing. And they're getting into the profession because they want to make a difference and then being burnt out often because the system is not supporting them to thrive. So we're supporting a number of projects around kind of teacher wellbeing and rethinking training, support and ongoing development for teachers. And then the third area that we're looking at is exclusions, because there's, on average, there's been, I think, a 30% increase in exclusions over the last year, and those kids, once excluded, and often sadly excluded because they aren't making the grade, and so with the pressure of exam results and league tables, these kids are actually often being off-rolled so that they're not affecting the league tables. Once they get excluded, on average, 1% of them go on to get 5 GCSE results, and they make up about half the percentage of the people in the prison population. So if we don't change our support for those kids, their trajectory is kind of scarily set. So we're supporting innovative projects that are turning around areas in the kind of outcomes in those 3 areas. So sorry, I banged on enough. But just a bit of context into kind of how we work. Jen, as I said, is one of our amazing pioneers. Do you want to give a little bit of context as to kind of why early years is such an important and understated area?
Yeah, thanks. So I guess this evening, I'll just tell kind of my own personal story into how I ended up often standing up in front of groups and describing myself as a tech entrepreneur, which is like the farthest thing that I ever thought I would say, because I was never particularly interested in technology or anything. But my own story starts in a very different world, which is I started out working in the think tank world, working with government and with policymakers. And my brief in the first job that I had at a think tank called Demos in London was to really get to understand better where inequalities were stemming from. So there's most of the public debate around social mobility at the time was around things like entry into Oxbridge and looking at like different pathways and professions in adulthood. But I was asked to look, well, where does the inequality actually begin? And so as I started researching that in that position, what I was learning through getting familiar with the academic literature, through reviewing the literature in general, was seeing that inequalities are starting much earlier on than we tend to talk about them. So we focus on what's happening later on. But one of the big things that I found, and I want to share a couple of the key lessons that I learned during that time, and one of them is around the gap in children's development that's already present before they even get into school for their first day of school, which in England, in the UK, is usually age 5. By that time, there's already a really considerable gap in things like children's vocabulary, in things like children's ability to focus their attention or concentrate, their ability to defer gratification, to sort of control impulses, and control their emotions and things like that. And these gaps that are present at the beginning of school, they then just grow over the course of the school years and contribute to the kind of debates that we tend to have around lack of access to university, lack of access to professions, and so on. So that was one thing that really struck me at that time, was if we really want to address equality and we want to build a more socially just world, we should probably start looking pretty early on in the human life cycle and human development. So that was one thing that really stuck with me. There's another thing that really hit me at that time, and it came out of the neuroscientific evidence that was really starting to that's really sort of changed how we understand human development over the past few decades. And the stat that really has stuck with me is that, again, before children even arrive into the formal education system when they're 5 years old, 85% of their brains, of our brains, were already developed. So 85% of the learning, of the habit forming, all of that stuff was already done before we even got into the classroom. And the way that those brains are developing in those early years, the way that early habits are getting set in place, good habits or bad habits, habits that push kids to be positive, to keep trying, to be curious, to be brave, or habits that push kids to be frightened, to not want to take risks, to give up, to have tantrums. Those habits are forming and are well formed actually before they're even getting into school. So that was a second thing that I really kind of grabbed onto and thought, okay, there's something going on in the early years that we really need to think about. If as governments or as societies we're thinking, where should we put our time and energy, where can we best invest our time and energy? The early years is starting to look like a pretty good place to do that. And I guess the third argument that I came across that has always really stuck with me was a genuine financial investor's argument about where, if a government is thinking like an investor, like a business person, and they're thinking, where am I going to lay down my money to get the best return on my citizenry or my labor force, or however you want to call the people within a society? Well, it's very clear, and it's been clearly economically modeled by a number of people, but particularly a guy at the University of Chicago called Professor James Heckman, who has modeled out the impact of investing in the early years, and particularly investing in disadvantaged children, so children from lower income backgrounds that don't have very vibrant, dynamic, supportive, consistent home learning environments, with parents who are building the types of resilience, strength, bravery, courage, all the stuff that's really good for kids. If we invest in those children in their early years, we get it's actually better than the stock market. We get like a 13.7% return on those kids in terms of what they're going to go on to achieve, their educational attainment, the skills that they're going to add into the labor force, but also the things that we're not going to have to spend on, like mental health issues, health problems, antisocial behavior, and all that kind of stuff. So really clearly modeled out. You can invest in a disadvantaged child's early years, and you're going to get a better return than if you just kind of put your money into a tracker fund in the stock market. And all of that to me felt like a really powerful set of arguments for doing more to support whatever's going on in the early years. So I could pause there. I mean, I could go into much more about how we
share a bit about the specific solution. So maybe share a bit about kind of easy peasy and why you chose that particular model.
Yeah. So for many years I worked on the level of policy, and I was kind of working with others in our kind of community to bring to light that evidence, to kind of bring forward the academics who are writing about this stuff, the development psychologists, the economists, and so on. And we were pushing to make change on a policy and political level. And actually, a lot of that has happened. There's a real cross-party consensus in the UK, but also there's a lot of recognition out in the States as well, in parts of Europe. People generally recognize that early intervention is the way to go. There are lots of different initiatives, different things that are happening to try and bring resources forward into the pipeline, invest money earlier in children's education. But one area where I learned that government is and they will say this quite openly, not like the best, is around like sometimes designing like good quality support for a particular group, which are parents. So a lot of when we think about some of the solutions or the supports that we can offer in children's early years, again, we're before the formal education system, so we can't work through the teaching workforce, we can't work through our buildings, our schools, and so on. We have to think differently about who our partners are in this, and actually our key partners are parents and people within a community. But government is like not the best at working with this group. So, you know, there's all the kind of, first of all, there'd be the concerns about like nanny statism, like stepping into the home, crossing thresholds of privacy. How is it that government can best support what's happening for parents and support really positive home learning environments in the preschool years? It turns out it's quite difficult, and I got really frustrated over the years, like trying to look for ways to do that and seeing examples of programs that were developed kind of internally that were really patronizing to parents or quite stigmatizing of certain parents, sort of blame culture about people from certain backgrounds, things that kind of labeled certain families troubled or problematic, and programs and support structures that were designed totally not in a human-centered way. So for example, if you're trying to support parents who are like holding down like 3 jobs, living paycheck to paycheck, like struggling to keep the lights on, but you designed a program that requires them to like travel to a faraway place and like come across into a government building that's going to be really like make them feel quite uncomfortable and challenged, like that's probably not going to work very well for that group, and you're going to probably like undermine their self-esteem and confidence further in the way that you've kind of framed that for them. And I was seeing a lot of that stuff from my position, and so over time I felt like there were other ways that we could provide support that would start from a position of you know, truths that we've certainly found in my company in terms of the research we've done with parents, which is that all parents are trying to do the best for their children. All parents like are tired and exhausted and don't tend to have much space in the day to do what they want to do. And thirdly, most parents a lot of parents I'd say, don't tend to understand the role that they play in their child's education. They might see their role as providing like nourishment and a roof over the head and so on, but they might not understand the neuroscience behind how the environment they produce at home and the ways they interact with their child are actually building that baby's brain, setting the foundations for their language and so on. So that the stuff that we learned about parents' real lives, I felt we could start from that point and design a support service that would be built around them. And that would support them. And so that's actually what I did when I left the policy world and I set up the company that I run now, which is called Easy Peasy. And our mission is to give every child the very best start in life, regardless of their background. And the way that we're doing that is through supporting early learning through play, and particularly getting parents more involved in playing and interacting with their young children with games and activities that are carefully designed by us to be fun, to be simple, and to build kind of key skills that are going to support kids when they get into the classroom, so that early gap is narrowed, and then the later gaps are narrowed too.
Do you want to give the example? I mean, you shared, like high five. Do you want to give the example that you shared today in the car about just like one of like how a parent would actually receive it and what it kind of tangibly is, and maybe one of
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So what we've done, we've thought quite carefully about the delivery model of our service. When I started out, I said like I often introduce myself as a tech entrepreneur, and I never really expected to do that. And when I set out with designing this solution, whatever it was, I was really just starting with the problem I had identified. I didn't know what we were going to come up with. But as we went through our design process, this was back in like 2014, we were discovering these things about what parents' lives were like, and we were using that to build into the solution we made. So as I said before, like one of the things was rather than trying to pull parents into different environments that are not part of their like daily routine, what if we were able to push content out to them in the kind of comfort of their own space or their own home? And one of the great ways of doing that is through using mobile, because we're all stuck to our phones. Parents are stuck to their phones just like we're stuck to our phones, and there are a lot of parents in the room, I'm sure, of course, as well. So I started looking into how we could use mobile as a channel to send out these activities, these game ideas, this information about early development to parents. And a second thing that we felt was really important to achieving our mission, which of course is to give all children the best start in life, regardless of their background, was to make sure that however we were providing our support or offering our support, that it was going to get to the parents who could benefit most and who could really do with the support. And to do that, we definitely wanted to partner with public services. So like we work really closely with like nursery schools, for example, and with primary schools. We work really closely with local authorities. We work closely with the Department for Education in the UK, and I hope one day we'll be working internationally with governments and school systems across the world. And what's really important about working with these groups is that they share the same mission that we do. So there's a lot of great policy, and this is an area I think where policy can work really well, where funding is designed to be rooted to the most disadvantaged children through something called the pupil premium. Schools and heads are all working to narrow gaps in development. That's part of how they're regulated by Ofsted, by our educational regulatory body. So by working through schools, they're incentivized to reach the same groups that we're incentivized to reach. So in practice, we'll license Easy Peasy to a school or a nursery or a local authority. They will sign up parents in their community. We'll use an API to kind of connect to manage for any techies out there to connect to their management information systems, get the details we need, and then we'll push out invitations to parents in the community through text messages to join their Easy Peasy pod, which is based around their school. And if they consent and click through that, then we start sending them this regular stream of game ideas, advice, information, and there's other elements in our service as well where they can share their experiences of playing with other kids. Teachers at school, nursery teachers, then get data about who's played games that week. They can use the game in their playroom or classroom environment as well. And we're trying, I guess, to bring back that old idea of like it takes a village to raise a child, and sort of bring lots of the different groups together to do that. But having that delivery model means that we can reach the groups we really want to be working with, and we can do the whole thing at a really low cost, because using technology to replicate and get things out is a lot cheaper than sending individual people out to do home visits, which is one of the key alternatives to what we're doing. Most of the alternative services to what we do are actually real people who are going into homes, which is an amazing service, and there are really fantastic groups doing it. But to get to the scale of my vision, which is to have a population level impact and narrow social mobility gaps on a big scale, technology seemed like a really important factor to helping us get there.
Yeah, and just kind of one of the ways, I mean, we signed up for, so Jen and what she's doing with Easy Peasy has basically been one of the solutions that you may have heard of, the marshmallow test. Has anyone heard of the marshmallow test, which kind of
You want to do it? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, well, you explain it, and then we can talk about it. It's
Yeah.
do a kind of a quick snippet, and then we'll just talk about the kind of
Sure. Yeah. So I could equally have mentioned and shared this other brilliant story, and it's a research study. There was a guy at Stanford in the 70s, a professor called Walter Mischel, and he was a psychologist, and he did a study with very young children aged 3-4 years old. And what he did with them is he took them each individually into a room, and he sat them down on a chair, and he said, okay, you can have this marshmallow right now, or if you can hang on for 5 minutes, you can have 2 marshmallows. And then he would leave the room and wait it out, and come back 5 minutes later and see what had happened. Did they decide to go for it and just chomp down? Or did they manage to wait, or did they sort of like eat half of it and sort of negotiate that actually they hadn't eaten it and they could have a second one? So lots of different scenarios that occurred. He then carried on his study tracking these children's development as they grew up. And what he found, and the reason this study has become so like notorious, is that he found a strong correlation between the ability to withhold eating that marshmallow, so what's called delaying gratification, and higher educational attainment at school, and higher future earnings as well. And so that story tells us a lot.
Stronger relationships.
And things like maintaining stronger relationships. So some really like surprising like scale and scope of the impact of this early ability to self-regulate. And actually, we were in the car. The reason we were talking about it is because we were thinking about all you guys gunning it up the hill, and just thinking about how important that ability is, that ability to delay gratification, to set a goal for yourself and stick to it, and how much that ability is already getting developed and set before kids even get into school, and how predictive it is of their future, how much of a trajectory is already set in the beginning. And for me, knowing the research really well, the role of parents and early learning at home, that is really what develops in children those abilities. So that ability to create a consistent home environment to help children learn how to regulate their emotions, to bounce back from mistakes. This is the stuff that's behind all human endeavor. And so I think that's why that story has tended to kind of capture people's imagination.
And one of the reasons I mentioned it is because actually Jen's program has basically been proven to have huge impact on the ability for young people to self-regulate, and so that is a huge predictor of life outcomes. And actually, by parents simply receiving a text message that says, have you thought about kind of playing this game with your child, and it's prompts to kind of get you to think about your engagement interaction. They then send you these videos of kind of games that you can play, which are based on science in terms of they're actually developing kind of your child's ability to kind of learn delayed gratification. And actually just by taking part in this simple thing in their own home, actually being able to really move the needle on this thing which is going to change life outcomes. And it's just, the reason we wanted to share that with you is actually, firstly, early years is critically important. Secondly, that actually by supporting solutions and thinking differently about charity spend, and actually by backing pioneers who found innovative solutions to things which can really have disproportionate impact on young people's lives, you really are making a big change. So it is worth that grind. You're not only kind of living it as you cycle up that hill and kind of really feeling your own, I suppose, horizons expand in terms of just believing what is possible for yourself, but the funds that you're raising are going to projects which are genuinely making a difference on young people, and particularly kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, trajectory. And what we do is we spend a lot of time figuring out what are those areas. So early years, teachers, exclusions are the areas we believe big change really is needed and innovation needs to happen. And we then spend a lot of time finding the best people who are as smart as this one, who've kind of done a hell of a lot of work, really understand it, and have come up with a solution which actually can really make a difference. So we wanted to kind of share a bit about that story, share more about early years, but mainly just say a huge thank you to all of you for your efforts in doing that and in supporting brilliant people like Jen, who are genuinely making a difference and actually showing that change kind of is possible. You guys can shift a mindset of what you think is possible in 5 days doing an amazing cycle. It is actually possible through a 6-week program to really shift the environment and actually have lasting effects on a parent's ability of how, on their ability to actually improve their relationship with their child if they just shift the way that they're interacting with them through these relatively simple games. And so, yeah, it was an opportunity to say thank you. I know everyone's really tired. If there are any questions or anything, please feel free to share them. Otherwise, just grab us. But it was just an opportunity to share.